Okay, so next section, I am aware that we only have a few minutes left. So just to briefly mention evaluation, like I said, make sure your effort is commensurate to the size of the project you're doing. If you're doing a one-off event, you don't need to do a full-scale research project with hundreds of very long questionnaires and so on. You just need to make sure that you have enough information to decide whether you've met your aims and objectives, and you've got enough information to make important decisions about future events that you might do. So, for example, with Rising Ape, we wanted to know whether our efforts were wasted in promoting events on different social media platforms. And we found out, as I've already said, that Facebook was the most important platform. So we decided to just go with Facebook and forget everything else to save our time and effort. Because you have limited time and effort when you're doing a project. You need to make sure that what you're doing is actually making an impact on the project. And again, it's always about going back to the aims and objectives, your own aims and objectives, but also the aims and objectives of the funder, whoever's commissioning the work, whoever's supporting the work, making sure that you have the information you need to show that you've met those. And so, of course, you can use a whole range of methods, questionnaires. Observation is really useful for events. If you're thinking about the kind of emotional experience that people are going through, you can definitely observe that. But also, for example, if you have an event where you're hoping to provoke discussion, you could have someone observing and noting down the kinds of discussion topics that come up so that you can report back the depth of the discussion, the extent of the discussion, the kinds of things people wanted to discuss, to see whether you've hit that point. Other things which are really useful, but like really useful, really simple, things like vox pops. So going around with and just so this is maybe more for a physical event, but going around and asking people for short quotes on what they thought, build up a nice story about the event, what people liked or didn't like about it, but also things like really simple things like feedback cards and so on. But what I would say is, if you're because I'm thinking maybe more about applying for a small amount of money where you might get enough money for a one-off event, keep it small, be creative, and try to work evaluation into the event itself. So maybe getting feedback from the audience as part of the event through a bit of audience interaction can be really useful, and it can give you real-time feedback you can act on in the moment. I'd just like to, I think we're basically the end, Frankie, so I don't want to keep you too long. But just one more thing that I want to show you is an example from a Rising Ape event of an evaluation questionnaire, just to show you the kind of thing that I'm talking about, which is very pared down, very simple. So unfortunately, in converting the questionnaire to Google, it's removed some of the formatting, but I'll just show it to you quickly so you can see what it looks like. So this was for a one-off event about the planet Mars, just to give you a one-sentence summary. And for young people, it was a very informal, very high energy, quite light-hearted, fun event. And so we decided to make the evaluation questionnaire lighthearted and fun as well. We also decided that we didn't need that much information from people to decide whether we've met our objectives. So we had just a couple of questions on a very small sheet of paper that we gave to people as they were leaving. How sciencey are you on a scale from 0 to 10? How would you rate your prior knowledge of the topics covered? Draw a face showing what you thought about the event. And would you come to an event like this again? Yes or no? That's all we wanted to check, because it was an experimental format. We just wanted to see, did people like it? Did they not? Would they come to something like that again? That's all we needed. If you're doing a larger scale project, you might need to get more complicated. But what I guess the point that I'm trying to get across is that if you're just doing a one-off small scale event with a small pot of funding, you just need to make sure you've met your aims and objectives, and don't go overboard. just make sure that the effort is commensurate with the size of the project that you're doing. So let's go back to the original presentation, and we will finish. So just to summarize this session kind of overall, the kind of points that I've been trying to get across, and hopefully you've kind of got these, is that it's really important to read and interpret a funding brief carefully. So you might want to think about, maybe have a particular funding brief in mind when you're thinking about your assessment, your assignment. When designing an experience, it's really important to consider story, narrative, identity, emotions, because they really should be underpinning some of the really practical decisions that you're making about your experience. But also be realistic about the logistics of your problem. Always go back to the aims and objectives and make sure that the effort you're putting in is actually commensurate, as actually in scale with the scale of the project you're doing as well. So that brings us to the end. I know that I've overrun ever so slightly, so I'm sorry for taking up an extra few minutes of your time, but I hope you've really enjoyed the session, because I've really, really enjoyed it. And it's been so nice to hear from you and your thoughts and your ideas. Does anybody have any questions about anything we've covered? Any final thoughts, comments, or anything of that nature?
Hey, David, thank you for the nice lesson. I'm actually curious about your project about interactive theater, which includes science in it. Can you tell me more about it?
Yeah, sure. So let's think. So your choice, which was the cancer research event, did involve a theatre element. It wasn't necessarily interactive theatre, but it was verbatim theatre. So we actually used the real words of cancer patients and nurses who work on cancer clinical trials as well. I think that worked quite well, because because the message we were trying to convey was more about the experience of taking part in a clinical trial, rather than maybe the scientific particularities, the scientific facts about a clinical trial. So that worked very well. It helped us to share what that experience is like. But also, I've worked on lots of projects which use maybe more interactive styles of theatre as a way to get for audience participation, to get people invested in a world, whether that's an imaginary world or a real world. So, for example, one of the projects that I've worked on with Rising Ape is called Publish or Perish, which was a kind of part improvised show about the life of an ordinary scientist, where the audience got to decide what the scientist did in the story. Having that kind of interaction was about putting the audience in the shoes of the working scientist. And it was done in a very fun, irreverent way. But it was about getting the audience to think about the considerations that scientists have to make in their daily lives, the balances they have to make, the choices they have to make between, well, as the name of the show would suggest, publish or perish, and the different pressures that scientists face. Presenting maybe a more real, in a silly way, but presenting a more realistic view of a scientist's life than the kind of lab coat stereotype. Sapphire, sorry, I can see you're going to say something.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So do the audience have to know something about science so that he can fit into the story?
No, not at all. So it's actually very deliberately written so that the audience doesn't need to know anything about science. The way that we present that is by actually through it's almost like a video game metaphor. So the way that the show is formatted is as if the scientist is a character in a video game, and the audience are almost playing the game by controlling the character. So it makes it very intuitive for the audience to understand the kinds of decisions that the scientists might make. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and jump back to the topic about your choice. And also Samantha also asked the same question. What was the game you played in your choice? Because I think the topic is a bit serious and sensitive.
Yeah.
And can you give me some examples? What games you have planned it or what you actually played it?
Yeah, so for your choice, we had to think really, really carefully about how we were going to present cancer research as a game, because games can be very silly, very, they're fun in theory, and that doesn't really fit with the seriousness of the topic. Although Cancer Research UK, who commissioned the work, were really keen on using a game format. So what we did is we had so I developed, it was essentially a tabletop board game, which the audience played. And in that board game, they were taking on the role, again, actually, interestingly, they were taking on the role of a scientist managing a research program. And so through the board game, they would have to consider different areas of research like preventative medicine or treatments for cancer, and so on and so on, balancing those different research priorities. And then at different points in the game, then they would stop, and there would be theatrical interludes with characters played by actors who represented real people involved in clinical trials, so nurses and patients, which kind of supported the game and helped to bring it into maybe into more of a real life context. So although it was a game format, it was more of a reflective experience than a kind of high energy fun game kind of experience, if that makes sense.
David, there is also a question from Rainbow. You can.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Sorry. Do you think attendance is an effective parameter for evaluation? I would say no. Actually, I feel very strongly against using attendance as your only measure of success. I think it is important to measure attendance because you need to know how many people came to an event or watched a talk or whatever the other thing is that you're doing. But I don't think it's a measure of success because it doesn't tell you anything about the kind of experience that those people had. You could have lots of people coming to an event, but if everyone thought it was really bad and they got a really bad perception of science from attending that event, although they would never attend a science event again because they didn't like it, then just by measuring attendance, you're not going to know that. And that's something that's really important to know. So I think it is important to measure attendance, but it's not an effective parameter for evaluating whether, or it's not an effective parameter on its own as evaluating whether an event is successful or not.